They thought they were laughing at a wife worn down to invisibility. They believed $5 was enough to turn me into a cheap punchline inside a banquet hall drowning in liquor and corporate power. But I did not walk through those doors that night begging to be seen. I came carrying something far more costly than my insulted dignity. I brought the exact truth required to collapse his career, our marriage, and his entire company. My name is Yvonne Watkins. I am 34 years old, and I live in the manicured, sprawling suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina. To the neighborhood, I am just another mother pushing a stroller across the sunlit sidewalks, a quiet fixture in the background of a wealthy community where the lawns are always perfectly green and the driveways hold expensive, polished cars. But before the routine of domestic invisibility settled over my shoulders, I was someone else entirely. I was a graduate student immersed in the sharp, clean world of operations analytics, while others saw chaos in the world. I saw the hidden architecture. People in my department used to say I had a rare gift. Give me a mountain of chaotic, screaming numbers, and I could strip away the noise to find the quiet, breathing pattern underneath. Data was my native language, and I spoke it with a fluency that commanded respect in every room I entered. My professors looked at me not just as a student, but as a future peer who would redefine supply chain efficiency models for decades to come. I met Brent Holloway at a crowded university alumni fundraiser on a humid September evening. The banquet hall smelled of expensive catering, wilted floral arrangements, and desperate networking. He was a junior executive at the time, trying desperately to climb a very steep corporate ladder, and he was visibly sweating through his tailored suit. His pitch deck for a potential client was a complete disaster. I did not intend to save him. I was simply reaching past him for a glass of cheap wine when I glanced over his shoulder at the printouts scattered across his high-top table. His margins were completely misaligned, and his projected growth models were based on a fundamentally flawed premise. Within 15 minutes, wielding a borrowed red pen, I completely dismantled and rebuilt his entire presentation. I reorganized his projections, stripped out the marketing fluff, and built a pricing model that actually held weight. He stared at me as if I had just reached into the dark and handed him a winning lottery ticket. He did not fall for my face or my figure first. He was captivated by my brain. He saw a powerful engine, and he wanted to drive it. Brent pursued me with the relentless, calculated energy of an ambitious American man who knows exactly how to acquire what he wants. He knew how to say the exact right sentences at the exact right time. He knew how to make sweeping promises that sounded like solemn vows before we ever even discussed marriage. He made me feel incredibly seen, convincing me that he viewed my intellect as a rare and precious treasure. He would take me to dimly lit, high-end steakhouses, order the finest wine, and ask for my input on his client accounts. He would lean across the table, his eyes locked on mine, hanging on every single word I said as I casually solved his workplace bottlenecks over dessert. It was deeply intoxicating to be valued like that, to believe I was one half of an unstoppable power couple heading straight for the top of the corporate food chain. Then came the unplanned pregnancy. I was 27 years old, in the final, grueling months of my thesis, which focused on predictive loss algorithms in mid-sized logistics firms. I had just secured a highly competitive internship at one of the most promising operations consulting firms on the East Coast. My desk at the firm was waiting for me. Everything I had worked for over the past 6 years was finally aligning perfectly into place. And then, there was Eli, growing quietly inside me, turning my meticulously planned life upside down. Brent proposed almost immediately. He arrived at my apartment with a diamond ring and a perfectly structured master plan. He held both of my hands and promised that hitting pause on my education and my career would only be for 1 year. Just 12 short months, he swore with tears in his eyes. He told me that once our son was a little older and we had found our footing, he would support me with every resource we had to return to the firm stronger and more focused than ever. We are a team. Yvonne, he said, his voice thick with what I believed was absolute sincerity. "I will not let your brilliance go to waste. I promise you that." And then his mother, Lorraine Holloway, stepped into the picture to ensure I stayed exactly where her son needed me. Lorraine had a terrifyingly polite way of cutting you open without ever raising her southern, honey-coated voice. Over Sunday dinners, surrounded by her pristine fine china and glasses of sweet iced tea, she would carefully lay the psychological traps. She would casually mention how a decent, loving mother would never leave her helpless infant to be raised by strangers in expensive daycares just to chase a harsh, demanding corporate title. She planted the heavy seeds of guilt deep into the fresh soil of my new motherhood. She watered those seeds every single week with sweet smiles, offering unsolicited advice that felt like beautifully wrapped insults. She made it abundantly clear that my personal ambition was a direct threat to her grandson's well-being and her son's peace of mind. Exhausted by the physical toll of pregnancy and overwhelmed by the emotional pressure coming from all sides, I chose the compromise. It felt like the noble, loving thing to do for my new family. I boxed up my research books. I formally shelved my thesis. I called the consulting firm and let the internship go, forcing myself to endure the heavy disappointment in the hiring manager's voice. I stayed home to rock my beautiful baby boy, wiping spit up and tracking nap schedules instead of tracking corporate supply chains. But my mind still craved the sharp edges of analytical work. The hunger for complex problem-solving did not magically disappear just because I became a stay-at-home mother. So, after Eli finally fell asleep for the night, I would sit alone at our kitchen table and help Brent, while the neighborhood was completely dark and silent. I would open his laptop. I would tweak his clumsy proposals. I would comb through thousands of rows of his data and fix the glaring errors he had completely missed. I would write the entire structural flow of his presentations, feeding him the exact words he needed to say to win over skeptical boards and tight-fisted investors. I became the invisible ghostwriter of his rapidly escalating success. Brent secured the first massive, career-making commercial deal of his life entirely because of a strategic framework I drew up on a yellow legal pad right there on our kitchen island at 2 o'clock in the morning. I remember the evening he came home bursting with the news. He brought a bottle of expensive champagne, laughing loudly as he lifted me into the air, celebrating our shared victory. I drank the cold champagne. I smiled back at him, feeling a warm glow of pride mixed heavily with physical exhaustion. I genuinely believed I was just taking a temporary step back for the greater good of our family unit. I thought I was simply pouring the concrete foundation for our shared future, a future where my turn was waiting just around the corner. I did not realize, as I raised my glass to toast his shining success, that I was casually handing him the keys to my own life. I did not know that this kitchen table victory was the very first time my future was quietly, lovingly stolen from me. That promised single year evaporated. It dissolved into 3 years. And then, with the terrifying speed of unrecorded days, it stretched into 5 long years. Whenever I carefully broached the subject of re-enrolling in my graduate program, usually over the deafening hum of our stainless steel dishwasher, Brent would adopt a look of strained, manufactured patience. He would sigh heavily, adjusting his expensive silk tie in the hallway mirror, and tell me to wait until Eli was a little older. "He needs his mother right now," Brent would say, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that effectively shut down any room for argument. "We can talk about your degree next fall," he would promise. But next fall never arrived. Instead, the walls of my life slowly moved inward. The shift was not a sudden earthquake. It was the slow, deliberate, and calculated tightening of a vise. It began with the bank accounts. Brent quietly transferred our primary funds into a new portfolio, changing the passwords and leaving me with a modest weekly allowance on a shared debit card. When I asked him about it, he chuckled, patting my hand as if I were a confused child. "I handle high-level finance all day," he explained smoothly. "I am simply better equipped to manage our wealth. You should just focus on the appropriate things. like the house in Eli. The sheer audacity of his statement was staggering. The man who could not balance a basic projection model without my red pen now claimed he was the sole financial mastermind of our household. That was how the subtle poison seeped into our daily existence. The very intellect he once worshipped became a liability he needed to neutralize. Those early, breathless compliments about my brilliant mind warped into casual, toxic remarks dropped over morning coffee. If I commented on an article about global market trends, he would roll his eyes. "You have been out of the workforce for half a decade." "Yvonne," he would point out, a cruel edge sharpening his tone. "The industry moves fast. You are too soft now. Your skills are completely outdated. It is a bloodbath out there. And frankly, you just do not have the killer instinct anymore." He was dismantling my confidence brick by brick, ensuring I would never feel strong enough to walk out the front door and prove him wrong. And if Brent was the architect of my containment, his mother, Lorraine, was the warden. She appeared unannounced at least 3 times a week, her luxury sedan gliding up our driveway like a stealth predator. She framed these visits as helpful check-ins, but they were purely surveillance missions. She would arrive precisely at 2 in the afternoon, running a manicured finger over the top of the refrigerator to check for dust. She would rearrange the organic snacks in my pantry, clucking her tongue at my choices. During our agonizing Sunday dinners, she would observe my posture, correcting the way I sat or the way I cut Eli's chicken. "A wife reflects her husband's success," she would murmur, sipping her expensive Pinot Noir. "You look exhausted, dear." Perhaps a touch of blush, so Brent does not have to come home to a ghost. Meanwhile, the ghost was still doing his heavy lifting. What began as a favor turned into an unwritten, non-negotiable expectation. Brent stopped asking for my help and started demanding it. He would casually drop a flash drive on the kitchen counter at 9 o'clock at night. "I need the pricing models restructured by 6 in the morning," he would say, already walking toward the bedroom to sleep. I would sit in the dark, my eyes burning from the screen glare, rebuilding his flawed negotiation scripts and redesigning his entire sales deck. The next day, he would email those exact files to his senior partners, my meticulous data models sitting proudly underneath his bolded name. He treated my ideas as if they were automatically his to use. He was wearing my brain like a tailored suit, taking all the credit, the handshakes, and the lucrative bonuses while I washed his coffee mugs. When the economy took a slight dip and our disposable income tightened, Brent presented his most insidious gift yet. He announced, with the magnanimous air of a benevolent savior, that he had secured a job for me at his firm, North Vane Systems Group. He spun it beautifully. He told me it was the perfect way to bring in some extra money without straying too far from Eli's preschool schedule. He made it sound like a favor. The title he handed me was Conference Services Coordinator. I walked into the towering glass and steel building of North Vane, a place where my mind should have been commanding the executive floor, and was handed a plastic name tag and a heavy 2-way radio. My job was entirely invisible logistics. I spent 40 hours a week smoothing out wrinkled tablecloths in dreary meeting rooms. I printed out hundreds of laminated event badges. I spent my afternoons arguing with catering vendors over the ratio of decaf to regular coffee and reconciling minor, frustrating conference expenses. I was reduced to an invisible support role. Moving quietly around the edges of the corporate world I was meant to be part of. The proximity was absolute agony. I was trapped inside the very ecosystem that should have been mine. I would push a heavy metal cart of stale pastries past the glass-walled boardrooms, watching young, sharp-suited analysts drawing sloppy supply chain models on whiteboards. They were models I could have corrected in my sleep. I could see the glaring inefficiencies in North Vane's operational flow just by walking from the supply closet to the freight elevator. But nobody wanted the opinion of the woman hauling the ice buckets. The ultimate humiliation, however, came directly from my husband. Whenever our paths crossed in the wide, sunlit lobby or during a catered luncheon, Brent treated me like an absolute stranger. If an important client or a visiting vice president happened to notice me refilling the water pitchers and asked who I was, Brent would not even claim me as his wife. He would offer a tight, dismissive half smile, his eyes sliding right past mine. "Oh, her," he would say, his voice cool and detached, as if I were a piece of rented furniture. "That is Yvonne. She handles the setup fine." He stripped me of my dignity, my intellect, and my marital status in a single breath, reducing me to a functional object in his peripheral vision. The pain of his public detachment was sharper than any physical betrayal could ever be. I was not just abandoned inside the walls of my own marriage. I was actively forced to haunt the hallways of a life I was explicitly barred from living. Every single day, I had to swallow the bitter ash of watching lesser minds celebrated, while the man who swore to protect my brilliance used it as a stepping stone, leaving me behind in the silent, suffocating dust. I was a ghost watching my own life happen to someone else. Working in the conference services department was intended to be my ultimate cage, a daily reminder of my designated place at the very bottom of the corporate food chain. Brent thought that by assigning me to fold napkins and schedule room cleanings, he was keeping me docile and contained. But he forgot one fundamental, unshakable rule of operational logistics. The people who manage the physical infrastructure of a building see absolutely every single thing. The executives in their glass-walled corner offices only see the polished final reports. I, on the other hand, saw the raw, unfiltered machinery, every single room booking schedule, every catering invoice, the itemized costs of extravagant client gifts, and the detailed event reports tied directly to Brent's high-tier accounts flowed through my mundane little inbox before they ever reached the corporate accounting department, because my access was deemed completely inconsequential. My digital footprint went entirely unmonitored. No one bothers to audit the woman coordinating the coffee carts. My brain had been starved for complex data for over half a decade, so it latched onto the daily influx of spreadsheets like a drowning person clinging to a piece of driftwood. It started with a subtle discrepancy I noticed on a sluggish Tuesday afternoon while reconciling the monthly vendor payouts. A supplier registered as Blue Arbor Events appeared consistently across multiple vendor contracts, and every single one of those contracts bore Brent's digital signature of approval. The invoices were staggering. They were billing Northvane Systems Group for premium floral centerpieces and high-end audiovisual equipment rentals at rates hovering nearly 40% above the highest market average in the city. The addresses listed for Blue Arbor were just commercial mail drops. There was no warehouse. There was no physical inventory. Then came the ghost dinners. I was manually processing a thick stack of expense reports for a massive fourth-quarter client intensive. Brent's ledger claimed he hosted a luxurious, plated dinner for 85 visiting executives in the Oak boardroom, complete with a top-tier open bar and custom corporate gifts. The problem was glaringly obvious to me. I was the coordinator on duty that exact evening. I was the person who locked the heavy oak doors of that boardroom. The room had been completely dark and empty. I had personally turned off the lights at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. There were no 85 executives. There was no open bar. It was just ink on paper, bleeding thousands upon thousands of dollars into thin air. Signed off by my husband. The quiet, nagging suspicion in my mind solidified into cold, undeniable certainty during the annual spring corporate summit. I was hauling a heavy plastic crate of surplus promotional folders into the dark. Cramped supply closet, situated directly behind the main ballroom stage. The temporary partition walls were incredibly thin. Through the drywall, I heard Brent's voice, sharp and arrogantly loud, speaking to another senior partner in the corridor. The partner sounded genuinely nervous, his voice tight with anxiety about an impending internal audit scheduled for the third quarter. Brent just laughed, a deep, resonant sound full of absolute dismissiveness. Audit season is only scary for those who do not know how to push the numbers to the right places, he bragged casually. The sheer audacity of his confidence made my blood run cold. He was not just arrogant, he was actively, systematically stealing from the firm, and he felt utterly invincible doing it. That weekend, a heavy, suffocating silence hung over our house. Brent was away on a golf trip, supposedly securing another major account. I was in the dusty garage, sorting through old cardboard boxes to find Eli's winter coats. My fingers brushed against a small, silver object buried at the very bottom of a plastic storage bin. It was my old USB drive. I brought it inside, wiped away the dust, and plugged it into my battered laptop. The screen illuminated with the brilliant, undeniable ghosts of my past. There was my unfinished master's thesis, perfectly structured and waiting. Below it sat folders upon folders containing the original pricing models, the algorithmic flowcharts, and the complex presentation templates I had meticulously built for Brent during the first 2 years of our marriage. Seeing my own untouched brilliance frozen in time, sitting right next to the foundational work that had launched his fraudulent career, broke something massive open inside my chest. The heavy blanket of depression lifted, replaced by a crystalline, icy clarity. The next morning, I found a quiet hour while Eli was at preschool and dialed the number for my old academic advisor, Professor Dana Mercer. I had not spoken to her in 5 years. The moment she heard my voice, the time gap vanished. I haltingly described a hypothetical scenario, asking about supply chain anomalies and vendor shell structures. Dana stopped me mid-sentence. She did not hear a tired, defeated housewife. She heard the brilliant, razor-sharp analyst she used to mentor. She realized exactly how deeply my talent had been buried and manipulated. "You need to get your teeth back into the game. Yvonne," she urged fiercely, her voice crackling over the phone line. She immediately sent me an enrollment link for an intensive, high-level remote certification program specializing in forensic accounting and corporate compliance. My nights drastically changed. After I tucked Eli into his bed, reading him a story and turning on his little revolving star projector, I did not go out to the kitchen island to fix Brent's sloppy spreadsheets. I sat at my own small desk in the dark corner of the guest room. I studied with a ferocious, consuming hunger. I tore through complex modules on financial fraud, regulatory compliance frameworks, and corporate embezzlement structures. And as I absorbed the material, I applied every single theoretical lesson directly to the living, breathing organism of North Vein Systems Group. I quietly transformed my husband's professional life into my own private, meticulously documented crime scene, operating like a digital ghost. I began saving everything. I discreetly printed hard copies of the inflated Blue Arbor invoices, slipping the papers into the false bottom of my tote bag before leaving the office. I exported the hidden metadata from Brent's most celebrated, wildly successful sales decks. I pulled the deeply embedded author properties that undeniably proved the original framework. Files were created on my personal computer, registered to my name, years before he ever claimed them as his own genius. I cross-referenced the physical room schedules I managed against his fraudulent, bloated expense reports, highlighting every single impossible discrepancy. Furthermore, I carefully documented the specific linguistic footprints in his most praised executive summaries. The phrasing, the structural rhythms, the specific cadence of the data analysis were undeniably my own academic writing style. He had not even bothered to change my syntax. I organized every single piece of data into a heavily encrypted digital vault, backing it up to a secure cloud server, while a physical binder of hard evidence remained locked inside the trunk of my car beneath the spare tire. As the weeks turned into months, my binder grew thicker. As the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, I sat back in my chair and looked at the glowing screen of my laptop. At this specific point in time, I was not actively plotting a grand, cinematic vengeance to destroy him. I was simply a woman standing quietly on the edge of a massive corporate fault line, feeling the deep, violent tremors beneath my feet. I knew with absolute certainty that Brent's towering arrogance was nothing more than a fragile house of cards. I also knew that when the corporate auditors finally came knocking and the walls began to close in, A cowardly man like him would instinctively look for a convenient scapegoat. A lowly, invisible conference coordinator with direct access to the billing systems and vendor schedules would be the absolute perfect target to absorb the blame. I did not want to burn his world down yet. I just made a silent, ironclad vow to myself in the quiet darkness of my home. If the day ever arrived when Brent Holloway tried to push the heavy consequences of his crimes onto my shoulders, I would absolutely not go down in silence. The atmosphere at North Vane Systems Group shifted from arrogant complacency to a tight, nervous energy as the autumn months dragged on. The firm was quietly bleeding capital and desperately trying to secure a massive refinancing package. The financial lifeline they needed was tightly controlled by a prominent investment fund spearheaded by a notoriously ruthless woman named Celeste Rowan. Celeste was known across the financial sector as a surgeon with a balance sheet. She cut out the organizational rot before she ever authorized a single wire transfer. If this specific deal collapsed, multiple executive chairs would immediately empty, and the company would face catastrophic restructuring. To appease Celeste's rigorous due diligence demands, the North Vane board hired Mara Bell as their new chief compliance officer. Mara carried a terrifying, unyielding reputation. She cared absolutely nothing about office politics, corporate loyalties, or executive golf handicaps. She only cared about airtight, bulletproof ledgers. I knew Mara Bell was the exact catalyst my carefully gathered data required. Late one Tuesday evening, while my husband snored loudly in the master bedroom, I sat at my small desk, using a secure proxy server and an encrypted email account. I initiated my campaign. The message I sent to Mara contained absolutely zero emotional narrative. It was not the desperate plea of an overworked, unappreciated wife. It was a surgical strike of pure, unfiltered data. I listed 6 specific invoice codes tied directly to the fictitious Blue Arbor Shell Company. I provided the exact calendar dates of 3 high-capacity executive dinners, juxtaposing those dates with the corresponding building security logs that proved those specific conference rooms were physically locked and completely empty on those exact evenings. I outlined the mathematical pattern of the 35% markups on the fraudulent catering bills. I hit send and quietly closed the laptop. I knew a seasoned professional like Mara would never ignore a tip so mathematically precise. It took Mara exactly 3 days to trace the operational perspective of the anonymous leak. She quickly realized the granular data could not have originated from a high-level executive dashboard. The specific details regarding room locks, surplus catering manifests, and vendor arrival times meant the whistleblower was walking the actual physical floors of the building. She sent a cryptic, single-line reply to my burner email, naming a dilapidated, 24-hour diner situated 2 towns away from the North Vane headquarters. I arrived 20 minutes early on a freezing Thursday evening. The diner smelled heavily of stale fry grease and strong bleach. When Mara slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, her sharp eyes widened for a fraction of a second. She instantly recognized the invisible, silent conference coordinator who had poured her black coffee during the Monday morning operational briefings. My hands were trembling so violently beneath the table that I had to clasp them together. But the moment I opened my mouth, the physical fear completely evaporated. I spoke in the crisp, authoritative cadence of the high-level operations analyst I truly was. I laid out the financial discrepancies flawlessly, walking her through the fraudulent vendor loop with absolute precision. Then, I pushed a thick manila folder across the sticky Formica table. This was the precise twist that elevated the entire situation from mere corporate embezzlement to a profound, devastating theft of intellectual property. Inside the folder were side-by-side highlighted comparisons of Brent's foundational career-making sales decks and my original academic research files from my incomplete master's thesis. He had not just stolen company funds to line his pockets, he had actively stolen my brain. He had taken my complex predictive pricing models, stripped away my authorship, changed the font styles, slapped the North Vane corporate logo on the header, and used my intellectual labor to secure his rapid executive promotions. Mara traced the metadata timestamps with her index finger, her expression hardening into absolute, unyielding stone. She leaned back against the vinyl booth, tapping her pen thoughtfully. We needed an undeniable, deeply public transfer of this evidence. If she simply walked into the Human Resources Department on a random Tuesday morning, Brent's powerful allies on the executive board would immediately bury the investigation to save the fragile refinancing deal. Mara told me I had to hand over the original, physical hard drive, and the unredacted master ledger in a setting where a corporate cover-up would be entirely impossible. She selected the upcoming North Vane annual holiday party. It was a mandatory, opulent gala held at a luxury downtown hotel. More importantly, Celeste Rowan and the lead legal counsel for her investment fund were flying into the city specifically to attend as guests of honor, Mara explained, her voice low and steady. That taking possession of the evidence directly in front of the prospective investors would establish an impenetrable, legally binding chain of custody. It would force the company's hand in real time, with zero room for quiet negotiation, during the final week leading up to the gala. I began the quiet process of shedding my invisible skin. I took a portion of the grocery money I had secretly hoarded over the last few months and walked into a high-end consignment boutique. I did not purchase a dress to look like a desperate woman trying to seduce her wandering husband back into her arms. I aggressively bypassed the flashy sequins, the plunging necklines, and the loud colors. Instead, I selected a tailored, midnight blue gown that fit me like a modern suit of armor. It was elegant, architectural, and completely unforgiving in its sharpness. Afterward, I sat in a brightly lit salon chair and instructed the stylist to cut off the tired, messy ponytail I had hidden behind for the last 5 years. My hair fell to the linoleum floor in heavy, dark clumps, leaving a sleek, blunt bob that perfectly framed a jawline I had completely forgotten I possessed. I looked into the mirror and finally recognized the woman staring back. On the night of the corporate gala, I stood alone on the damp, freezing pavement outside the Grand Hotel, watching the valet staff frantically park an endless stream of luxury vehicles. I could hear the muffled, heavy bass of the expensive live band echoing from the grand ballroom on the second floor. I adjusted the heavy strap of my clutch purse, which held the meticulously organized flash drives and the printed metadata reports. I took a deep, steadying breath of the sharp December air. I was not walking up those wide, carpeted stairs with a heart full of hope. I was not looking for an apology or a chance at marital reconciliation. I placed my hand on the heavy brass door handle, perfectly and calmly aware that when this night was finally over, one of our 2 lives was going to shatter into a million unrecoverable pieces, and for the first time in a very long time. I knew it was not going to be mine. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Sovereign Hotel was drowning in a sea of amber light and aggressively loud corporate triumph. The air was thick and heavy, smelling strongly of roasted tenderloin, heavily poured bourbon, and the distinct, expensive cologne worn by men who firmly believed they owned the city. A 12-piece brass band played a deafening swing tune in the far corner, desperately trying to mask the overwhelming roar of 200 executives aggressively networking and celebrating their own perceived brilliance. Standing at the absolute epicenter of this glittering, chaotic room was my husband. He had commandeered the small stage positioned at the front of the hall. A heavy black microphone gripped tightly in his right hand. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson, a very clear indicator that he had consumed at least 4 or 5 glasses of premium scotch before the dinner service had even concluded. He was enthusiastically playing the role of the charismatic master of ceremonies, acting as the undisputed life of the party, and soaking up the undivided attention of the room like a parched sponge. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed corridor just outside the heavy, brass-studded mahogany doors. The plush carpet beneath my feet absorbed the sound of my heels. I did not push my way inside the room immediately. I waited quietly in the vestibule, listening to the booming reverberation of his slurred voice echoing through the state-of-the-art speaker system. The evening's printed itinerary included a brief, light-hearted charity auction to benefit a local children's hospital, which was a standard, highly calculated public relations maneuver for North Vane Systems Group. Brent had apparently decided to hijack the transition between the silent auction and the live bidding. I could hear the arrogant, uneven cadence of his speech as he paced back and forth across the stage, pausing deliberately for comedic effect. "All right, gentlemen, before we get to the luxury golf packages, I have a very special, unlisted item for the block," Brent announced loudly into the microphone, his voice echoing against the crystal chandeliers. A low murmur of curiosity rippled through the expansive ballroom. "Who wants a night with my wife? Let us start the bidding nice and low. I will open the floor at $5. A beat of absolute, stunned silence hung in the warm air, followed almost immediately by a sudden, eruptive roar of laughter from the tables situated nearest the stage. It was the loud, guttural laughter of older men who had built their entire careers on casual misogyny and unchecked power. At the peripheral tables, however, the reaction was vastly different. Several younger female executives visibly stiffened in their chairs, their polite smiles freezing into tight, deeply uncomfortable grimaces. But Brent was entirely oblivious to the shifting, dangerous temperature of the room, emboldened by the raucous applause of his sycophants. He leaned much closer to the microphone, his voice dripping with venomous, unchecked mockery. "I am entirely serious. Gentlemen, $5 is an absolute steal. She comes fully equipped to complain about how tired she is. Fold your laundry with terrifying precision, and look completely miserable while you try to enjoy a simple evening out. Any takers? Going once for the woman who makes my daily life a living, breathing nightmare." I stepped out of the shadows and pushed the heavy mahogany doors wood open. I did not walk into that room alone. To my immediate left stood Mara Bell, her posture incredibly rigid, her dark eyes scanning the room with cold, terrifying precision. To my right stood Celeste Rowan, draped in an impeccably tailored ivory suit, radiating an aura of absolute, freezing authority that demanded immediate submission. The three of us formed an impenetrable wall at the entrance. The visual impact of our sudden arrival hit the back of the room first. The waitstaff holding silver trays of champagne stopped dead in their tracks. The executives standing near the open bar slowly lowered their highball glasses to the counters. The loud, boisterous laughter that had been rolling through the hall began to fracture and dissolve, dropping to the floor like shattered pieces of delicate crystal. The profound silence moved forward like a physical wave, swallowing the brass band, extinguishing the hushed conversations, until the only sound left in the massive space was the harsh, ringing feedback of Brent's microphone from his elevated position on the stage, blinded by the harsh glare of the amber spotlights. Brent did not recognize me at first. His brain was entirely conditioned to look for a defeated woman wearing a faded winter coat, her hair pulled back into a messy, exhausted knot, her eyes permanently cast downward in total submission. He squinted hard against the light, his drunken smile faltering as he tried to identify the stunning, sharp-edged woman wearing a midnight blue gown standing directly beside the two most powerful figures in the entire financial sector. For a split second, he actually thought I was a visiting corporate dignitary, and then, as the collective gaze of 200 people slowly swiveled from the brightly lit stage directly to the doorway, the realization violently struck him. The flush of alcohol drained from his face in a single, terrifying second, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His hand began to tremble uncontrollably, sending a low, rhythmic thumping sound through the audio system as his finger tapped nervously against the plastic casing of the microphone. A genuinely smart man would have dropped the microphone, apologized profusely, and walked off the stage immediately. But Brent was a man built entirely on a fragile ego and a desperate need for self-preservation. In a spectacularly foolish attempt to save face in front of his superiors and the prospective investors, he chose to double down. He forced a loud, incredibly hollow chuckle that echoed awkwardly across the silent room. He gestured toward me with a sweeping theatrical motion of his free hand, trying desperately to reframe his extreme cruelty as harmless corporate entertainment. Look who finally decided to show up. Just a little marital humor. Right, honey? I was just keeping the crowd warmed up for the main event. He waited for me to break. He fully expected the old Yvonne to flush bright red with profound humiliation, drop her gaze to the floor, and quietly retreat into the hallway to cry in the coat room. He was banking his entire professional reputation on my deeply conditioned silence. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream across the room, nor did I rush the stage to slap his face. I simply stood there, my spine completely straight, feeling the immense, crushing weight of his panicked gaze and the horrified stares of his colleagues. The air in the room felt incredibly thin, vibrating with a lethal tension. I looked directly into his wide, bloodshot eyes, and I projected my voice clearly and evenly into the deafening silence. Please do not stop the recording now. The effect of those 7 words was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Mara Bell stepped forward, cutting through the paralyzed crowd like a sharp knife through silk. She bypassed Brent entirely and marched directly toward the audiovisual booth situated at the back corner of the hall. She flashed her thick corporate credentials at the terrified young technician running the soundboard. I am the Chief Compliance Officer for North Vane Systems, Mara commanded, her voice slicing through the heavy air with zero room for negotiation. You will immediately save all audio and video feeds from the last 45 minutes to a secure external drive. You are to hand that drive directly to me right now. Cut the microphones. Turn up the house lights. This program is officially suspended due to a severe, actively recorded violation of our corporate conduct policy. The ballroom immediately erupted into a chaotic symphony of panicked whispers and frantic movement. Senior executives scrambled to physically distance themselves from the stage. Board members frantically pulled out their phones to dial their legal counsel. On the stage, under the glaring, unforgiving fluorescent house lights that had just flared to life, Brent stood completely paralyzed. His mouth hung slightly open, the microphone resting uselessly against his thigh. He stared across the room at me, the thick fog of the alcohol finally burning away to reveal a stark, terrifying clarity. He finally understood the absolute gravity of his fatal miscalculation. The woman he had just attempted to publicly auction for a measly $5 had not arrived to beg for her dignity back. She had walked through those doors flanked by the exact 2 people holding the absolute power to evaluate, price, and completely dismantle every single stolen asset he possessed. The morning sun filtering through the kitchen blinds offered absolutely no warmth. I stood by the marble island, watching Brent pace frantically across the hardwood floor. He was not nursing the heavy, silent hangover of a deeply remorseful husband who had realized the profound cruelty of his actions. He was vibrating with the frantic, cornered energy of an executive who had just realized his safety net had been completely severed. He did not look at me with an ounce of regret. He only cared that Mara Bell had seized the audiovisual footage and immediately initiated a lockdown on his primary financial directories before he could delete anything. You orchestrated that entire spectacle, Brent hissed, his voice hoarse from the previous night. He slammed his coffee mug onto the counter, spilling hot liquid across the pristine stone. You deliberately set me up. You marched into that ballroom with Celeste Rowan just to humiliate me. Do you have any idea what you have done to my career? There was no apology for the $5 price tag he had placed on my dignity. There was only fury that his captive audience had been stolen, before I could even process the absolute lack of contrition. The front door swung open. Lorraine had arrived, undoubtedly summoned by a panicked early morning phone call from her son. She marched into the kitchen, her designer trench coat perfectly belted, immediately assessing the situation and positioning herself as the impenetrable shield between her precious son and his supposedly vindictive wife. You are overreacting, Yvonne, Lorraine stated flatly, not even bothering to say good morning. She began wiping the spilled coffee with a paper towel, her movements sharp and annoyed. He had a few too many drinks at a high-pressure corporate event. Men in his position carry immense stress. They make stupid jokes to blow off steam. And instead of pulling him aside quietly like a supportive partner, you decide to publicly drag him through the mud and destroy this family. It is incredibly selfish. I looked at the two of them, the mother and the son, perfectly aligned in their manufactured reality. The sheer absurdity of their defense extinguished whatever lingering hesitation I held. Seeing my absolute lack of reaction, Brent shifted his strategy from defense to outright warfare. He stepped dangerously close to me, lowering his voice into a vicious, calculated whisper. "If you say one more word to compliance, Yvonne, I will bury you. I will terminate your position at the firm today. You will have zero income. I will keep this house, and I will hire the most aggressive legal team in the state to convince a family court judge that you are entirely too unstable to raise Eli. You have zero resources. Do not test me." He grabbed his leather briefcase and stormed out the door, Lorraine trailing closely behind him, leaving the house suffocatingly quiet. He firmly believed his threats would paralyze me, just as they had for the last 5 years. He was entirely wrong. As soon as the sound of his engine faded down the street, I picked up my phone and called Dana. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in the heavily paneled office of Vera Sloan, one of the most ruthless and effective employment and family law attorneys in the city. Dana had made the introduction, and Vera had cleared her entire morning schedule the moment she heard the phrase corporate retaliation. Vera did not offer me warm tea or sympathetic tissues. She offered me a heavily structured battle plan. She laid out the exact parameters of my legal protections in stark, practical terms. We were going to file an immediate petition for temporary custody based on documented psychological coercion. Simultaneously, she was preparing a massive workplace retaliation firewall, because I had officially submitted protected whistleblower evidence to the chief compliance officer before Brent could terminate me. Any attempt he made to fire me, evict me, or discredit my mental state would immediately trigger severe federal penalties against North Vein Systems Group. Armed with Vera's legal architecture, I returned to the empty house. I did not waste time crying over old photographs or agonizing over the memories embedded in the expensive furniture. I moved with cold, mechanical efficiency. I packed 3 large suitcases. I gathered birth certificates, social security cards, our passports, and every single piece of financial documentation I had secretly copied over the months. I packed Eli's favorite clothes, his heavily worn stuffed bear, and the small glowing star projector he needed to fall asleep. I did not leave a dramatic, tear-stained letter on the kitchen island. I simply placed my heavy set of house keys next to the sink, picked up my son from his preschool, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. We relocated to a small, renovated carriage house situated in the sprawling backyard of Dana's property. It was not glamorous. The floorboards creaked loudly, the heating system hummed, and the kitchen consisted of little more than a hot plate and a miniature refrigerator. But as I unpacked Eli's toys in the small living room, a profound, overwhelming sensation washed over me. The air felt incredibly light. For the first time in half a decade, I was not being monitored. There was no one checking the dust on the shelves, no one mocking my intelligence, and no one demanding that I shrink myself to fit into their narrative. It was brilliantly, beautifully quiet. While I was tucking Eli into his new bed that evening, Brent was launching his first desperate counterattack, realizing I had disappeared from the house. He immediately marched into the North Vein Human Resources Department. He filed a formal, severe internal complaint, accusing me of utilizing my low-level security clearance as a conference coordinator to maliciously hack his accounts and steal highly classified corporate data. He demanded my immediate termination and threatened to press criminal theft charges, but he had completely underestimated the woman I had brought into the ballroom. Mara Bell had anticipated his exact maneuver. The moment Brent's complaint hit the human resources desk, Mara intercepted it and completely neutralized his attack. She calmly informed the executive board that every single document, file, and flash drive in my possession was already logged, secured, and heavily protected under a formal corporate legal hold. I had not stolen company data. I had officially submitted evidence in an active, federally mandated fraud investigation. His attempt to frame me as a jealous, thieving wife backfired immediately, cementing his guilt even further into the corporate record. Sitting at the small, scratched wooden table in the carriage house, I watched the snow begin to fall outside the window. I had absolutely no illusions about the brutal war that was about to unfold. I knew Brent would fight violently. I knew the divorce would be deeply contentious and the corporate fallout would be massive. I had not secured a final victory yet, but as I drank a cup of cheap tea in the quiet darkness, I realized a fundamental shift had occurred within my own spirit, for the very first time in years. The suffocating fear of what my husband might do to me was no longer stronger than my own fierce, undeniable self-respect. Vera Sloan operated with the terrifying, silent precision of a wartime general. She immediately filed an emergency petition in family court, securing a temporary restraining order and full physical custody of Eli before Brent even had the opportunity to hire a defense attorney. Simultaneously, on the other side of the city, Mara Bell turned the corporate headquarters into an active, hostile forensic battleground. It was a brilliantly coordinated, two-front assault. While Vera built an impenetrable legal fortress around my son and me, Mara systematically dismantled the fraudulent financial empire my husband had constructed. Mara deployed an elite, independent information technology team to confiscate every single digital device assigned to Brent. They completely bypassed his superficial passwords and dug deeply into the hidden, deleted archives of his hard drives. What they dragged into the harsh fluorescent light of the compliance office was absolutely staggering. They successfully recovered dozens of foundational drafts for his most lucrative, career-defining proposals spanning the last 4 years. Every single one of those massive, multi-million-dollar pitches was built directly upon the structural framework of my original, discarded academic files. The data architecture, the predictive algorithms, the highly specific market analysis parameters were undeniably mine. He had merely erased my name, applied the corporate letterhead, and claimed my intellectual labor as his own intrinsic genius. The financial investigation moved with incredible, devastating speed. The fictitious vendor I had flagged, Blue Arbor Events, was rapidly unraveled by Mara's forensic accountants. It was not a legitimate hospitality service. It was a deeply convoluted limited liability company registered to a residential address in a neighboring state. The registered agent on the corporate filing was not an experienced event coordinator. It was Brent's former college fraternity brother. The scheme was remarkably crude but highly effective. Hundreds of thousands of corporate dollars flowed out of the firm to pay for wildly inflated floral arrangements and phantom catering services. Once the money cleared the shell company bank account, it was quietly funneled right back into Brent's hidden offshore accounts, carefully categorized as vague, untraceable consulting fees. As the walls of the compliance department closed in, the culture of absolute fear Brent had cultivated on the executive floor began to shatter. A junior financial analyst named Tessa Quinn, no older than 25, walked into Mara's office. Tessa was visibly shaking, clutching her employee badge, and formally requested federal whistleblower protection. She confessed that Brent had cornered her in a deserted break room several months prior. He had explicitly ordered her to artificially inflate the attendance headcount on 3 major client dinners by 60 people each. When she hesitated, noting the severe ethical violation, Brent casually threatened to completely destroy her upcoming performance review and ruin her early career. Sitting at the scratched wooden table in the carriage house, reading Mara's heavily encrypted digital updates, a profoundly chilling realization struck me. It was a twist so deeply sinister and calculated that it made the breath catch violently in my throat. An external, third-party audit of North Vane Systems Group was entirely inevitable by the end of the fiscal year. when those ruthless auditors eventually discovered the massive, glaring holes in the catering and event budgets. The legal fallout would have to land somewhere. It would land directly on the department explicitly responsible for authorizing and processing those specific vendor expenses. The Conference Services Department. Brent had not just given me a humiliating, low-level administrative job to keep me entirely under his control. He had meticulously and deliberately positioned his own wife to be the ultimate, unsuspecting scapegoat for his massive federal financial crimes. If his plan had succeeded, I would have been the one facing a prison sentence. Fueled by a sudden burst of adrenaline, I began digging frantically through my remaining cardboard boxes of personal belongings. At the very bottom of a heavy carton, buried beneath old textbooks, I found a battered, black leather notebook. I flipped through the yellowed pages. Inside were my original, handwritten, and heavily annotated mathematical formulas for a highly complex client retention model. Exactly 3 years ago, Northvane was on the absolute verge of losing its most strategic, high-yielding telecommunications account. I had sketched out this exact predictive model on our kitchen island over the course of 3 sleepless nights while nursing a sick infant. Brent took my notebook to work, presented the flawless model to the board of directors as a sudden epiphany he experienced on a late-night flight, and used it to save the account, securing a massive bonus. I now had the physical proof resting in my hands, dated in blue ink, proving exactly who the real strategist in our marriage had always been. The situation rapidly escalated far beyond a simple domestic dispute or a quiet human resources termination. Celeste Rowan, the absolute financial linchpin of Northvane's continued survival, bypassed the executive chain of command and delivered a ruthless, unyielding ultimatum directly to the board of directors. She stated unequivocally that if the firm attempted to minimize my evidence, or if they tried to quietly sweep Brent's actions under the rug to protect their corporate image, her investment fund would instantly withdraw their massive refinancing package. Her threat would plunge the entire company into immediate, unrecoverable bankruptcy. Suddenly, the meticulously documented files I had compiled in the dark corners of my guest room were no longer just a wronged woman's personal leverage. They were the singular, vital lifeline holding an entire corporation together. Knowing his professional and personal worlds were violently collapsing simultaneously, Brent drastically changed his strategy. The aggressive, towering threats of legal ruin completely vanished, replaced by a pathetic, desperate sweetness. My phone buzzed constantly. He left dozens of voicemails throughout the day and night. His voice was thick with manufactured tears, begging me to remember our wedding vows and the early days of our relationship. He pleaded with me to just come home, promising that we could sit down and fix everything together. He spoke as if I had merely overreacted to a minor disagreement over the household budget. He truly believed that if he just played the role of the broken, deeply loving husband, my legendary softness would instinctively kick in, and I would willingly reset the entire board to save him from his own destruction. I listened to his final, weeping voicemail while sitting alone in the dark, watching the heavy winter snow fall against the glass window of the carriage house. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no lingering affection, and absolutely no desire to heal the massive, bleeding wound he had selfishly inflicted upon my life. I realized, with a sudden icy clarity that settled deep into my bones, that I no longer wanted an apology from him. An apology was meant for an accidental slight, a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate, protracted, and highly calculated theft of my entire existence. I did not want his empty tears or his hollow promises. I wanted the absolute, unvarnished truth to be permanently illuminated, placed exactly in the center of the corporate stage where he had once stood so proudly to perform. The counteroffensive did not begin with legal motions. It began with a vicious, highly coordinated whisper campaign. Brent knew he could not defeat the raw data, so he immediately set out to destroy my credibility. Word quickly filtered back to me through the very few sympathetic contacts I still possessed within the administrative pool. Brent was stalking the executive floors, pulling senior partners into hushed, closed-door meetings. He painted a masterful, tragic picture of himself as the victim of a deeply unhinged, vindictive spouse. He began planting the rumor that I was suffering from a severe psychological break, driven by bitter jealousy over his rapid success. Worse, he insinuated to anyone who would listen that I had initiated a clandestine, inappropriate relationship with someone inside the compliance department, completely fabricating the financial anomalies in a hysterical attempt to orchestrate a hostile takeover of his career. While Brent polluted the corporate waters, the attack on my personal sanctuary commenced. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, my cell phone rang. It was the director of Eli's preschool, her voice tight and vibrating with professional anxiety. Lorraine had bypassed the outer security gate and planted herself squarely in the main reception area. She was aggressively demanding a printed copy of Eli's attendance records and his daily pickup schedules, when the staff politely refused, citing privacy protocols. Lorraine escalated. She leaned over the reception desk, loudly whispering to the teachers that I was experiencing a violent mental breakdown and was maliciously hiding her grandson from his loving, deeply concerned father. She framed herself as the desperate, rescuing grandmother trying to save a child from an unstable mother. I did not panic. I did not rush to the school to engage in a screaming match in front of toddlers. I immediately called Vera Sloan, operating with the lethal, silent efficiency of a wartime general. Vera neutralized the threat within exactly 45 minutes. She had a courier physically hand-deliver a legally binding, court-stamped directive directly to the school's front desk. The document established a rigid, non-negotiable protocol. Lorraine was permanently barred from the premises under threat of immediate arrest for trespassing. Furthermore, Brent was granted only 2 highly restricted, fully supervised visitation windows a month, strictly enforced by a neutral, court-appointed third party. Vera built an impenetrable concrete wall around my son, ensuring the chaotic, desperate adult warfare could not touch him. Meanwhile, the situation inside the towering glass walls of North Vane Systems Group was reaching a violent boiling point. Mara Bell had officially suspended Brent without pay, pending the final resolution of the fraud investigation. However, the absolute founder of the company, Reed Vale, suddenly intervened. Reed was a towering relic of the old corporate guard, a man who viewed ethical collateral damage as just another acceptable line item on a quarterly balance sheet. He was absolutely terrified of losing the massive refinancing package. He wanted a quiet, surgical extraction to protect the brand. But Mara had struck an entirely new vein of gold. While digging through the secured, highly restricted electronic archives, she unearthed a deeply buried human resources vault. Brent's personnel file was not the pristine document he claimed it to be. There were 3 separate, heavily suppressed complaints filed over the past 7 years by female subordinates. The documents detailed a distinct, horrifying pattern of public humiliation and verbal degradation during out-of-state sales trips and closed executive retreats. The sickening charade he pulled in the ballroom was not an isolated, alcohol-fueled mistake. It was his established, highly protected method of asserting dominance. He had simply performed his favorite, degrading trick in front of the wrong women on the wrong night. And Reed Vale had been quietly burying the evidence for nearly a decade, desperate to contain the escalating disaster before the investors caught wind of the systemic cultural rot. Reed Vale's personal attorneys bypassed Mara entirely and sent a formal settlement offer directly to Vera. An elegant, heavy envelope arrived via certified mail at the carriage house. Inside was a contract offering me exactly $750,000. It was a life-changing amount of money, but it came attached to a suffocating, unbreakable non-disclosure agreement. It explicitly required me to sign a joint, legally binding public press release declaring that the entire ballroom incident and the subsequent financial discrepancies were nothing more than a regrettable misunderstanding under severe personal stress. I was being asked to formally, legally gaslight myself in exchange for a comfortable bank account. I sat at the small kitchen table, staring blankly at the thick, cream-colored paper. Dana Mercer walked into the room, setting down 2 mugs of hot tea. I pushed the contract across the scarred wood toward her. She read the terms, her expression completely unreadable. Then she looked up, her sharp eyes locking onto mine with absolute, piercing clarity. "If you sign this, Yvonne," she said softly, her voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute truth. "If you take their hush money, Brent merely loses his current title. He will quietly resign, take a lateral position at another firm across the country, and continue living the magnificent lie he built on your back. But if you stand up and speak every single word out loud, he loses the fundamental, fake story he uses to survive. He loses the illusion of his own brilliance." Her words struck the exact core of the iron that had been slowly hardening inside my chest over the last few months. Accepting their money meant allowing them to permanently erase my reality. It meant letting the entire corporate ecosystem believe I was just a hysterical, confused wife who had misinterpreted a bad joke and a few complex spreadsheets. I realized that to completely reclaim my life, I had to be willing to stand entirely in the harsh, unforgiving light, even if that light illuminated the most profoundly humiliating night I had ever endured. I picked up a black pen, drew a single, thick line through their meticulously drafted settlement figure, and dropped the contract into the trash bin. I did not spend the subsequent days crying over my broken marriage or practicing a tragic, emotional narrative for the upcoming formal board hearing. I approached my testimony as the most critical business presentation of my entire existence. I laid out my massive binders of evidence across the living room floor. I mapped out the financial discrepancies, the stolen academic architectures, and the buried human resources complaints into a flawless, impenetrable chronological timeline. I was no longer a wounded, complaining spouse seeking marital revenge. I was a brilliant, highly trained operations strategist, systematically reclaiming my stolen professional portfolio, one indisputable, devastating fact at a time. The venue for the final confrontation was finalized, and the corporate irony was incredibly sharp. The special board hearing was formally scheduled to take place in a private executive suite on the top floor of the Plaza Sovereign Hotel. It was the exact same building where, only weeks prior, my husband had stood on a brightly lit stage and attempted to auction my dignity to a room full of intoxicated executives for a mere $5. The timing was entirely merciless. The board had exactly 72 hours before Celeste Rowan's massive refinancing deadline expired. If they did not resolve the profound structural and ethical rot by Friday morning, the capital would vanish, and the company would plunge into immediate receivership. Brent did not intend to surrender quietly. Recognizing that his charming executive persona had completely failed, he hired a notoriously aggressive defense attorney. This man specialized in utterly destroying the credibility of corporate whistleblowers through sheer legal brutality. They immediately launched a vicious counterattack, formally filing a motion that accused me of malicious corporate espionage. Their heavily publicized narrative was incredibly predictable. They claimed I was a deeply jealous, vindictive, estranged wife who could not handle my husband's soaring success. According to their fabricated timeline, I had illegally accessed his secure network from our marital home, manufactured the glaring discrepancies in the ledgers, and actively planted the financial anomalies to orchestrate his professional ruin during a messy divorce. It was a desperate, sloppy trap, and it failed spectacularly. They vastly underestimated the sheer technological firepower of the digital forensics team Mara Bell had deployed. During the preliminary discovery exchange, Brent's high-priced attorney triumphantly produced a digital server log. The document allegedly showed my old, dormant user credentials accessing the Northvane mainframe and downloading the disputed pricing models late at night. The attorney smiled smugly, believing he had just secured a swift victory. But Mara's lead investigator simply slid a thick stack of corresponding Internet Protocol logs across the table. The access ping had indeed originated from the wireless router located inside my former marital home. However, The indisputable timestamp on the unauthorized login was dated exactly 3 days after Vera Sloan had legally established my new physical residency at the carriage house across town. Brent had clumsily used my old passwords from the comfort of his own living room sofa, completely forgetting that my physical location and my restricted access were already matters of strict legal record. He had deliberately attempted to frame me for a severe federal crime, and he had left his own undeniable digital fingerprints completely covering the weapon. When Reed Vale, the terrified founder of the company, attempted to use this devastating revelation to force a quiet, closed-door resignation, the situation escalated again. Celeste Rowan absolutely refused to allow another cover-up. She informed the executive board, in no uncertain terms, that her multi-million-dollar investment fund would absolutely not proceed under a veil of secrecy. She demanded that the entire evidentiary hearing be conducted transparently, with a full, unredacted presentation of the facts laid bare before the key stakeholders. There would be no secret golden parachutes. There would be no sealed settlements. The infection had to be exposed to the open air. The night before the hearing, I stood in the small bathroom of the carriage house, staring into the bright mirror. I was systematically shedding the last remaining layers of the invisible, compliant woman I used to be. I laid out my armor for the following morning, a perfectly tailored, dark charcoal suit that fit with sharp, architectural precision. My freshly cut hair framed my face in clean, severe lines. Stacked neatly by the front door was my battered leather briefcase. Inside that case rested the physical copy of my unfinished master's thesis, the original handwritten notebook from 3 years ago, the highlighted vendor invoices, and a meticulously color-coded timeline of undeniable evidence. I was completely ready for the war ahead. But the true, unbreakable hardening of my resolve occurred just after 8 o'clock that evening. I was sitting on the edge of Eli's bed, pulling a heavy blue quilt up to his chin. He looked up at me, his small eyes incredibly wide and serious in the dim, rotating light of his plastic star projector. "Mommy," he whispered softly, his little voice trembling just slightly in the quiet room. "After tomorrow, are we still going to have to whisper at night, that single, innocent question struck the center of my chest with the devastating force of a physical blow. For 5 long years, my young son had absorbed the silent, suffocating tension of a household where his mother's voice was constantly suppressed, monitored, and hushed so his father could maintain the illusion of absolute control. I leaned down, kissed his forehead, and promised him with absolute certainty that we would never, ever have to whisper in our own home again. That small, heartbreaking question calcified every remaining ounce of my fear into pure, weaponized steel. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, 2 hours before the formal proceedings were set to begin, I received an unexpected text message from an unknown number. It was Reed Vale, desperately requesting a completely off-the-record meeting in the hotel's vacant lobby cafe. I found the aging founder sitting alone in a dark corner booth, looking physically ill. He slid a sleek black folder across the polished table. It was not a settlement offer for my silence. It was a massive bribe for my mitigation. He offered a staggering allocation of fully vested stock compensation and an ironclad, heavily funded trust for Eli's future college tuition. All I had to do, Reed explained in a hushed, pleading tone, was slightly soften my upcoming testimony regarding Brent's intellectual property theft. I could nail my husband on the catering fraud and the shell companies, but if I publicly exposed the fact that the firm's most lucrative, foundational accounts were actually built on stolen academic data, the massive legal liability for North Vane Systems Group would be catastrophic. I did not even open the black folder. I slowly pushed it back across the table, my hand completely steady. I looked the powerful founder directly in his panicked eyes. "My demands are no longer financial. Reed," I told him, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "I do not want your corporate hush money. I demand a formal, highly public correction of authorship on every single model, algorithm, and proposal built from my intellectual property. I demand absolute, legally binding protection for Tessa Quinn and every other junior employee my husband attempted to use as a human shield. And I demand a full, unredacted referral of his financial activities to the state commercial fraud investigators. Anything less is completely unacceptable. Reed stared at me, the color draining entirely from his face as he finally realized the woman he thought he could easily purchase was actually the one holding the match to his entire empire. I walked away from the cafe and headed straight for the private elevators. The impending collision was now only minutes away. As I rode the velvet-lined elevator up to the executive suite, I felt a strange, profound sense of calm settling deeply into my bones. I knew exactly what was waiting behind those heavy mahogany doors. I knew Brent would be sitting at the massive conference table, aggressively adjusting his expensive silk tie, flanked by his ruthless legal counsel. I also knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that despite the towering mountain of evidence and the rapidly collapsing walls all around him, my husband still fundamentally believed I would falter. He still truly believed that the quiet, soft wife he had meticulously broken down for half a decade simply did not possess the sheer, ruthless courage required to walk into a room full of powerful executives and look him dead in the eye. He thought I would tremble. He thought I would break. He was about to learn just how dangerously wrong he was. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite closed behind me with a solid, echoing thud. The room was freezing, over-air-conditioned to combat the nervous sweat of the 12 most powerful individuals in the North Vane hierarchy. They sat tightly around a massive, polished granite conference table. Brent was positioned near the head of the table, flanked by his aggressive defense attorney, his posture rigidly defiant. He refused to make eye contact with me as I took the single empty leather chair positioned directly across from him. The air was so thick with tension, it felt difficult to pull into my lungs. Mara Bell stood at the front of the room, next to a massive digital display screen. She did not begin the emergency board hearing by distributing thick packets of quarterly financial reports or legal summons. She simply dimmed the overhead lights and pressed play. The very first image to illuminate the dark room was not a balance sheet. It was high-definition audio-visual footage from the hotel ballroom just weeks prior. The screen flared with amber light, and the deafening, slurred voice of my husband filled the sterile executive suite. Every single board member sat frozen as they watched Brent laugh uproariously into the microphone, asking the crowd who wanted a night with his wife, explicitly setting the starting bid at a pathetic $5, watching it replay in the sober, unforgiving daylight of a formal corporate tribunal stripped away any lingering illusion of harmless entertainment. The video concluded, and the screen faded to pitch black. The suffocating silence that immediately followed in that room was infinitely more painful than the raucous, humiliating laughter I had endured that night. It was the heavy, condemning silence of powerful men realizing their golden boy was a catastrophic, radioactive liability, before Brent's attorney could even open his mouth to offer a desperate contextual defense. Mara launched the second wave of our coordinated assault. The screen lit up again, this time with raw, indisputable mathematics. She displayed the exact timeline of the fraudulent catering invoices, juxtaposing them flawlessly with the building security logs. She revealed the convoluted structure of the limited liability company, tracing the precise flow of stolen corporate funds directly into Brent's hidden offshore accounts. She projected the sworn, signed affidavit from Tessa Quinn detailing the artificially inflated client dinner headcounts. And finally, she displayed the brutal, undeniable metadata. The board watched in stunned horror as the digital timestamps proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Northvane's most lucrative, foundational predictive models were originally authored on my personal computer, entirely conceptualized by my brain, years before Brent ever claimed them. Brent slammed his hands down onto the granite table, his face flushing a violent, panicked red. He attempted to loudly interrupt the presentation, desperately claiming that the data had been illegally manipulated by a jealous spouse. His attorney scrambled to hand out printed objections. Mara Bell simply stared him down with absolute, freezing contempt. She tapped a single key on her laptop, delivering the ultimate, fatal blow. It was an audio file. A saved voicemail Brent had frantically left for a subordinate just 2 days prior. His voice, stripped of all its usual arrogant polish, echoed through the suite, whining about the impending audit and instructing the junior partner to just blame it all on the facilities team so they could walk away clean. The entire room turned physically against him in that exact second. His own defense attorney slowly lowered his pen and leaned away from him, recognizing an utterly unwinnable war. But the absolute carnage was not finished. Mara immediately pivoted her crosshairs toward the founder of the company. Reed Vale shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair as Mara projected a series of heavily redacted human resources documents onto the screen. She explicitly detailed the 3 separate, severe complaints of workplace harassment and public humiliation filed against Brent by female employees over the past 7 years. Below each horrifying account was the unmistakable, sweeping signature of Reed Vale, formally ordering the complaints to be buried and settled quietly to protect the shiny, progressive image of the corporate culture. Reed's face drained of all color. He had tried to protect his empire by hiding the rot, and in doing so, he had engineered his own execution. What followed was a breathtaking display of ruthless, distinctly American corporate mechanics. The board of directors did not offer sympathy, and they certainly did not offer a dignified exit strategy. They moved to an immediate, binding vote. Within 15 brutal minutes, it was entirely over. Brent was formally terminated for extreme misconduct and cause. The board universally authorized an aggressive clawback provision, instantly seizing his unvested stock options and his accrued executive benefits. Reed Vale was forcefully instructed to submit his immediate, unconditional resignation to avoid a public shareholder revolt. Finally, the lead corporate counsel announced that the entire, unredacted financial dossier was being transferred directly to the state commercial fraud investigators before the end of the business day. Brent was not just losing his lucrative job, he was actively facing federal prison time. As the chaotic reality of the vote settled over the room, Celeste Rowan slowly stood up. She smoothed the front of her impeccable ivory suit. She looked directly at the terrified board members and announced that her investment fund would, in fact, proceed with the massive refinancing package and save the company from immediate bankruptcy. The executives collectively exhaled a massive sigh of relief. However, Celeste raised a single finger, silencing them entirely. She stated that the capital injection would only occur under a completely restructured operational framework. She then turned her sharp, calculating gaze directly toward me. She completely stunned the entire room by formally offering me the position of interim director of process recovery. She wanted the architect of those brilliant, stolen algorithms to take the absolute helm during the critical transition period. She wanted me to clean up the catastrophic mess my husband had left behind, at an executive salary that dwarfed what he had ever earned. Brent completely unraveled, the arrogant, towering executive persona violently shattered, leaving behind a pathetic, deeply broken man. He shifted wildly from red-faced fury to desperate, weeping supplication. He looked across the granite table at me, his eyes wide and frantic, realizing that the massive settlement he had offered me the day before was now completely worthless. When he realized I was not going to save him, his despair curdled into pure, venomous spite. He slumped back into his leather chair and spat out his final, bitter defense. He told me, his voice shaking with venom, that absolutely none of this destruction would have happened if I had just known how to stay home and do my part like a proper wife. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I looked at the man who had stolen half a decade of my life, my intellect, and my dignity, and I delivered a single, perfectly calm response that froze the remaining air in the room. You auctioned me for $5 because you thought my worth depended on your microphone. It never did. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I did not wait to watch the security guards escort him out of the building. I picked up my battered leather briefcase, the physical weight of my reclaimed life resting securely in my hand. I walked out of the massive executive suite and made my way down to the sunlit lobby. Vera Sloane was waiting for me near the grand entrance, holding the small, warm hand of my son. Eli looked up at me and smiled brightly. I shifted my heavy files to one arm, reached down, and firmly grasped his hand with the other. Together, we walked out of the grand, opulent hotel space that had once been used to publicly humiliate me. I stepped out into the bright, freezing morning air, leaving Brent trapped in the dark shadows behind me. Finally understanding that the true, devastating cost of his cruel little joke was not just a handful of cash, but the entire magnificent life he falsely believed he had the permanent right to own. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible journey with me today. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.